They gave him a paralyzed bride as a twisted payment for a blood debt, expecting him to crumble under the burden. But Jesse Stormwind, a half-Maidu tracker whose ancestors read the stars like sacred text, would teach her to soar beyond the heavens themselves, turning their cruelest mockery into the most beautiful love story the Sierra Nevada had ever witnessed.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The year was 1878, and the mountain town of Granite Falls, California, clung to the granite cliffs like a desperate prayer, built around a silver mine that had made rich men richer and poor men dead. The town existed in that brutal space between civilization and wilderness, where human nature showed its truest colors. The saloons never closed, the gambling never stopped, and the violence was as regular as the mountain winds that howled through the passes each winter, carrying with them the spirits of all who had died trying to tame this unforgiving land. In the midst of this chaos lived Jesse Stormwind, a name that carried both reverence and suspicion in equal measure. His father had been Maidu, one of the indigenous people who had called these mountains home for thousands of years, before the first white boot ever touched Sierra soil. His mother had been Irish, a prospector's daughter with fire-red hair and a heart that saw past skin color to the soul beneath. Their union had created something the town couldn't quite categorize, a man who moved through both worlds, but belonged fully to neither, existing in that liminal space where outcasts either found their strength or lost their souls entirely. At 29, Jesse possessed skills that made him invaluable to a town that lived on the edge of disaster. He could track a wounded bear through a snowstorm, find water in drought-stricken valleys, and navigate the treacherous mountain passes that claimed a dozen lives every winter. His knowledge came from two sources: ancient Maidu wisdom passed down through generations of his father's people, stories told around fires that burned long before Columbus ever dreamed of distant shores, and hard-earned experience surviving in a world that often wanted him dead, simply for existing with the wrong color skin and the wrong-shaped eyes. Jesse carried more than tracking skills and wilderness knowledge. 3 years ago he had made a mistake that cost life, a mistake that now hung around his neck like a millstone, growing heavier with each passing day. He had guided a mining expedition into the high country during what should have been a routine survey of potential claims. The job had seemed simple enough: lead 12 men into the backcountry, help them assess the mineral potential of several promising sites, and bring them safely home before the first snows closed the passes for winter. Jesse had been confident in his abilities, perhaps too confident. The expedition included Richard Holloway, son of the mine's owner and a man who wore his privilege like armor, expecting the world to bend to his will simply because his father's money said it should. But the mountains didn't care about money, or privilege, or the color of a man's skin. They were equal opportunity killers that judged everyone by the same harsh standards of preparation, respect, and luck. The warning signs had been there, subtle but clear to anyone who knew how to read them. The way the wind shifted in the pre-dawn hours, carrying scents that spoke of storms gathering beyond the visible horizon. The restless behavior of the wildlife, birds flying in strange patterns and small animals retreating to hidden places earlier than usual. Most importantly, the dreams that had haunted Jesse's sleep for 3 nights running, dreams where his grandfather appeared with sorrow in his ancient eyes, speaking in the old tongue about spirits angry at the violation of sacred places. Jesse had ignored the warnings, dismissed them as superstition competing with his desire to prove himself in the white man's world. The expedition's timeline was tight, and Richard Holloway had made it clear that delays would not be tolerated. So Jesse had pushed forward when wisdom dictated retreat, leading 12 men deeper into the high country. Just as the weather gods began their dance of destruction, the blizzard had come down, like the wrath of the mountain spirits themselves. A wall of white fury that turned the familiar landscape into an alien maze of wind and ice. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours, and snow fell so thick that a man couldn't see his own hand extended in front of his face. The expedition had been caught in open country, miles from any shelter, with nothing but their inadequate gear, and Jesse's knowledge standing between them and a frozen death. Jesse had fought that storm like a warrior battles an enemy army, using every trick his grandfather had ever taught him about surviving in the high country during winter's worst moods. He had found what shelter he could in the lee of massive boulders, rationed their food and fuel with the precision of a general managing a siege, and kept the men moving just enough to prevent frostbite, while conserving their strength for the battles ahead. For 3 days and 2 nights, Jesse had waged war against the mountain winter, making decision after agonizing decision about who could travel and who needed to rest, which routes offered the best chance of survival and which led only to death disguised as hope. In the end, he had managed to lead 8 men to safety, including Richard Holloway, guiding them down treacherous slopes in near zero visibility to reach the lower elevations where rescue parties could find them. But 4 men had died in that storm, 4 fathers and sons and brothers who would never see another sunrise because Jesse's Stormwind had misread the signs and led them into the killing cold. Their names were burned into his memory like brands. Thomas McKenna, barely 20 and saving money to bring his sweetheart west from Ohio. Carl Brennan, a veteran of the Civil War who had survived Gettysburg only to die in a Sierra blizzard. Miguel Santos, whose wife was expecting their first child. And James Patterson, whose 3 young children would grow up without a father because Jesse had trusted his confidence more than his grandfather's wisdom. The families of those dead men didn't care about the 8 who lived. They only cared about the 4 who didn't come home, and they blamed a half-breed guide who had led their loved ones into the killing cold. The official inquiry had cleared Jesse of any legal wrongdoing. The storm had been unprecedented in its severity, and witness testimony confirmed that he had done everything humanly possible to save lives. But legal exoneration couldn't wash the blood from his hands or silence the voices that haunted his dreams. Since then, Jesse had worked alone, taking jobs that kept him away from town for weeks at a time, living like a hermit in the high country, where the only judgment came from the wind and the only ghosts were the ones he carried in his own heart. He had built himself a small cabin high up in the timber, far from the whispers and sideways glances of Granite Falls, where the only neighbors were eagles and mountain cats who didn't care about his mixed heritage or his tragic past. The cabin was a simple structure, built from logs he had cut himself and chinked with mud and moss according to techniques his father had learned from the old ones. It sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient pines, with a clear view of the star-filled sky that his grandfather had taught him to read like a book written in light. Inside, the furnishings were sparse but functional. A bed built into one corner, a stone fireplace that could heat the single room, shelves lined with the few books he owned and the tools of his trade. Most folks in Granite Falls were content to let him stay there, hiring his services when they needed a guide or tracker but keeping their distance otherwise. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. Jesse got the solitude he craved, and the townspeople got access to his skills without having to confront the uncomfortable reminder of their own prejudices and the tragedy that had made him a pariah. Mourning that would alter the course of his life forever began like any other, with Jesse kneeling beside Devil's Creek in the pre-dawn darkness, reading signs in the muddy bank that told stories most men would never understand. The tracks were 3 days old, but still clear in the soft earth. A brown bear, female probably with cubs, moving north toward the high country, where the salmon runs provided easy feeding and the deep caves offered protection from winters. Approach. Ranch owner Tom Morrison had hired him to track the animal after it killed 2 of his prize bulls, valuable breeding stock that represented months of investment and planning. But as Jesse studied the tracks, his heart wasn't in the hunt.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The claw marks and pad impressions told a story of desperation rather than aggression. A mother bear trying to feed her cubs in a world where human expansion had claimed most of the traditional feeding grounds. Morrison's cattle had been grazing in valley meadows that had sustained bear families for generations, and the conflict was as inevitable as the changing seasons. Jesse could see the whole tragic story written in mud, the bear approaching cautiously, testing the air for danger before committing to the attack. The sudden charge when hunger overcame caution, the brief struggle as she brought down the bull, and then the hasty retreat with her prize, knowing that human retribution would follow as surely as sunrise. It was a story repeated across West, as two ways of life collided with the force of continental drift, and neither side could afford to back down. He was studying a particularly clear paw print, noting how the claws had dug deep into the soft earth as she launched her attack, when he heard the horses approaching from the east. 3 riders moving with the deliberate pace of men who had serious business to conduct and all the time in the world to conduct it properly. Jesse didn't look up immediately in his experience. White men on horseback in groups usually meant trouble for someone like him, and it was often better to let them make the first move rather than appear eager or threatening. Stormwind. The voice belonged to Karl Weber, the town's self-appointed leader and owner of the largest mercantile store in 3 counties. Weber was the kind of man who measured his worth by the number of people who owed him money and the size of his influence over their daily lives. He sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as someone who had never missed a meal or slept under the stars from necessity rather than choice. Behind Weber rode 2 men Jesse recognized, but had never spoken to beyond the basic courtesies required for business transactions. Marcus Dalton owned the sawmill that processed most of the timber harvested from the surrounding forests, and had a reputation for working his men harder than his machines, pushing both to their breaking points in pursuit of profit. The 3rd man was Samuel Pierce, a lawyer who had come west from Boston 5 years earlier with a carpetbag full of legal documents and a heart full of ambition, quickly establishing himself as the go-to attorney for anyone with money and flexible morals. Together, they represented the power structure of Granite Falls: money, industry, and the law bent to serve both. They were the men who decided which businesses thrived and which failed, which legal troubles disappeared and which destroyed lives, which residents were welcomed into the community and which were tolerated only as long as they remained useful. Jesse had managed to stay off their radar for the most part, but he had always known that his luck wouldn't last forever. Jesse finally looked up from the tracks, his dark eyes meeting Weber's pale blue ones without flinching or showing deference. "Morning, Weber. You're a long way from your store." His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew these mountains like other men knew their own backyards, but also the wariness of someone who had learned to expect trouble from unexpected visitors. "Unless you're here to help me track this bear, I'd say you're lost." Weber's smile was thin as winter ice, the expression of a man who enjoyed holding power over others and wasn't shy about displaying it. "Not lost, Stormwind. We came looking for you specifically. Got a proposition that might interest a man in your particular circumstances." The pause before particular circumstances was loaded with meaning that hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Weber was referring to Jesse's mixed heritage, his isolation from polite society, and most importantly, the legal and financial vulnerabilities that came with being an outcast in a world that rarely offered second chances to people like him. "I'm listening," Jesse said, though every instinct inherited from his Maidu ancestors was telling him to walk away, to disappear into the forest like smoke on the wind and let these men conduct their business with someone else. In the old stories his grandfather had told him around winter fires, When powerful men came with propositions, they usually involved traps disguised as opportunities, gifts that carried prices far higher than their apparent value. Marcus Dalton urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves splashing in the shallow creek water and disturbing the delicate ecosystem of insects and small fish that called Devil's Creek home. You remember Richard Holloway? The man whose life you saved 3 years ago? The question was loaded with irony thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone in 3 counties knew that Jesse had saved Richard's life during the blizzard, but everyone also knew that Richard's survival had come at the cost of 4 other men's deaths, a trade that some considered questionable at best. I remember, Jesse said simply, his voice carrying no emotion beyond simple acknowledgement. He remembered everything about that day, the way the wind had tasted wrong on his tongue, carrying flavors of ice and death from the high peaks. Strange color of the clouds, a shade of gray that his grandfather had taught him, meant the sky spirits were angry. The moment he realized his mistake and the desperate hours that followed as he fought to keep 12 men alive in conditions that would have killed experienced mountain men, he remembered Richard Holloway's grateful handshake when they reached safety, the tears in the young man's eyes as he promised to make this right someday, to find a way to repay the debt he owed to the half-breed guide who had saved his life. Jesse also remembered that promise being forgotten as soon as the grateful handshake ended, and Richard returned to his comfortable life in San Francisco, leaving Jesse to face the accusations and legal threats alone. Samuel Pierce, the lawyer, spoke up with the precise diction of an educated Eastern man who had never lost his Boston accent despite 5 years in the rough country of the Sierra Nevada. Mr. Holloway has recently found himself in need of a very specific type of assistance. His daughter, Caroline, was injured in a riding accident 8 months ago. A fall from her horse resulted in severe spinal damage that left her paralyzed. From the waist down, she requires constant care and supervision. Jesse's frown deepened as he tried to understand what any of this had to do with him. He was a tracker and a guide, someone who could find lost people and lead expeditions through dangerous country, not a nurse or a doctor trained in caring for invalids. What's that got to do with me? Weber leaned forward in his saddle, and Jesse could see the cruel satisfaction gleaming in his pale eyes like sunlight reflecting off a knife blade. This was the moment Weber had been anticipating, the reveal that would demonstrate his power and Jesse's helplessness in the face of forces beyond his control. Richard Holloway believes he owes you a debt for saving his life 3 years ago. He's prepared to pay that debt in a very specific way. He's offering you his daughter's hand in marriage, along with a substantial dowry and a piece of land just outside town where you could build a proper homestead. The words hit Jesse like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless and reeling. He straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt, not in threat, but in the unconscious gesture of a man preparing for attack. You want me to marry a crippled woman as payment for a debt? Caroline Holloway was one of the most beautiful young women in California before her accident, Pierce said with lawyer's precision, as if he were reading from a legal document rather than discussing a human being's life. She's well educated, comes from one of the finest families in San Francisco, and brings considerable assets to any marriage arrangement. The fact that she's physically limited ... shouldn't matter to a man in your position. The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took Jesse's breath away. In their minds he was so low, so worthless, so far beneath the consideration of decent society that a paralyzed woman was the best he could hope for in terms of matrimonial prospects. They were offering him damaged goods and expecting gratitude for the privilege of accepting their cast-off burden. But Marcus Dalton wasn't finished delivering the full scope of their proposition. Of course, there are other considerations that make this arrangement beneficial for all parties involved. Your accident 3 years ago left some unresolved issues. The families of those 4 dead men have been talking to certain lawyers about filing legal claims against you. Wrongful death, criminal negligence, reckless endangerment. Even if you ultimately win in court, the legal fees alone would ruin you financially. But if you were to marry into the Holloway family, become part of their social circle, well, those legal troubles might just disappear like morning mist. Now Jesse understood the true nature of their proposition, and the understanding hit him like ice water thrown in his face. This wasn't charity or even cruel humor. This was extortion wrapped in the ribbon of social respectability and tied with the bow of false generosity. Marry the crippled daughter and gain the protection of wealth and influence, or refuse and face legal destruction at the hands of families who had 3 years to plan their revenge. "And if I refuse?" Jesse asked, though he already knew the answer. From the satisfied expressions on their faces, Weber's smile widened into something that looked more like a wolf's grin than any expression of human warmth. "Then you refuse naturally. No one's holding a gun to your head, Stormwind. You're free to take your chances with the courts and see how far your reputation as a guide carries you when you're defending against 4 counts of wrongful death. I'm sure there are plenty of other towns across the territory that would welcome a half-breed guide with that kind of legal baggage trailing behind him." The threat was clear as mountain spring water and twice as cold. In 1878, a man with Jesse's background facing serious legal troubles would find doors closed to him across the entire Western Territory. Even if he won in court, the trial would destroy his reputation and his ability to make a living in the only profession he knew. He would be forced to leave everything he'd ever known, the mountains that were his home, the few people who still trusted him, the grave where his grandfather rested, and start over in a place where no one knew his name or his skills. Jesse looked down at the bear tracks in the mud, seeing in them a reflection of his own situation, a mother trying to survive in a world that wanted to destroy her for the simple crime of existing and needing to feed her young. The irony wasn't lost on him that these men were essentially asking him to become a caretaker for their unwanted burden while disguising it as an honor and a privilege. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging in his chest. "Take your time to consider all the implications," Weber said with magnanimous false generosity. "You have until sunset tomorrow to make your decision. The Holloway family is eager to resolve this situation as quickly as possible. Caroline's condition requires immediate attention and long-term planning, and they feel it would be best for everyone involved if she were settled with a husband who understands responsibility and won't be frightened away by the challenges involved." With that, the 3 men turned their horses and rode away, leaving Jesse alone beside Devil's Creek with the bear tracks, the morning mist, and the weight of an impossible choice that would determine the course of the rest of his life. He knelt back down beside the water, his reflection staring back at him from the rippling surface disturbed by the horse's departure. In that reflection, he saw his father's strong jaw and his mother's defiant green eyes, but he also saw something else, the trapped look of an animal with nowhere left to run and no good options remaining. As the sun climbed higher into the Sierra sky, Jesse continued his tracking work with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with questions that had no clean answers. The bear's trail led higher into the mountains, toward the sacred places his grandfather had shown him as a child, ancient groves where the old ceremonies had been conducted and the spirits still walked among the trees. Up there, among the star-touched peaks and the wind-carved stones, the Maidu people had once believed that all problems had solutions if you knew how to look for them with the right kind of eyes. By evening, Jesse had found the bear's den, a deep cave carved into the granite cliffs by centuries of wind and water, where she was nursing 2 cubs that tumbled over each other in the innocent play of the very young. He watched them from a safe distance, seeing the fierce protection in the mother's dark eyes and the complete trust in her babies. movements as they explored their small world under her watchful gaze. Tom Morrison had hired him to kill this bear, to eliminate the threat she posed to his cattle and his profits, but Jesse knew he couldn't do it. Some things were more important than money or reputation or the approval of men, who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. He made his decision about the bear the same way he would make his decision about Carolyn Holloway, by refusing to be the instrument of someone else's cruelty, by choosing to protect rather than destroy, even when protection came at a personal cost. But unlike the bear, Carolyn was already trapped in a cage made of social expectations and physical limitations. The question wasn't whether Jesse could save himself from Weber's carefully constructed trap, but whether he could find a way to save them both without losing his soul in the process. As darkness fell over the Sierra Nevada and the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Jesse Stormwind sat beside his small campfire and stared up at the celestial display that had guided his ancestors for countless generations. His Maidu grandfather had taught him that every star was a spirit watching over the earth, and that sometimes those spirits would send signs to those who knew how to read the ancient language written in light and shadow across the dome of night. Tonight, the stars seemed to be whispering of change, of paths that led through darkness toward unexpected destinations, of journeys that began with what looked like endings. The constellation his grandfather had called the Great Bear was rising in the east, and Jesse took that as a sign that his decision about the real bear had been the right one. Now he needed to find the courage to make an equally difficult choice. About the woman who had been offered to him like a piece of damaged merchandise that no one else wanted. Tomorrow, he would ride into Granite Falls and give Carl Weber his answer. He would meet Carolyn Holloway for the first time and see for himself what kind of woman had been offered to him in payment for a debt that could never truly be repaid. And then, perhaps, he would discover whether the stars had been right about the power of a man who refused to let the world define his worth or the worth of those he chose to protect. The fire crackled and danced, casting shifting shadows on the rocks around his camp that looked like the shapes of all the choices that lay ahead, some leading to destruction, others to redemption, and a precious few to something far more extraordinary than either. The morning would bring answers to questions he was afraid to ask, but tonight brought only the quiet certainty that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow, he would learn that sometimes the cruelest gifts become the most precious treasures, that real love has nothing to do with what the world thinks you deserve, and everything to do with what you're willing to fight for. And that the stars his grandfather had taught him to read were about to write a love story across the Sierra Nevada sky that would be remembered long after the last prospector had given up his claim and the last tree had been felled in the name of progress. The Holloway mansion squatted on the hill overlooking Granite Falls like a monument to stolen wealth, its whitewashed walls and manicured gardens a stark contrast to the rough mining town below. Jesse had never set foot on the property before, but he knew its history the way he knew the migration patterns of elk through careful observation and stories passed down by those who had witnessed its construction. The house had been built with silver pulled from Maidu sacred ground, its foundation stones quarried from cliffs where his people had once conducted ceremonies older than memory. As Jesse rode through the ornate iron gates, his horse's hooves clicking against imported cobblestones, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was entering enemy territory. The very air felt different here, thick with the weight of money and privilege that insulated its residents from the harsh realities that governed the lives of ordinary people. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the circular drive and exotic flowers bloomed in precise geometric patterns that had nothing to do with the natural rhythms of the Sierra Nevada ecosystem. A Mexican groundskeeper directed him toward the servants' entrance with apologetic eyes, but Jesse shook his head and rode directly to the main door. If he was going to be humiliated, it would be on his own terms, not according to social conventions designed to remind him of his place in the world's hierarchy. He dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post beside the front steps, and climbed toward the massive oak door that probably cost more than most families in Granite Falls earned in a year. The man who answered his knock was clearly a butler, though his expensive clothing couldn't quite disguise the hardness in his eyes or the way his hand instinctively moved toward the concealed weapon Jesse was certain he carried. This was someone who had seen violence, probably dealt it out when necessary, and now found himself playing the role of proper servant while maintaining the skills that kept wealthy families safe from the consequences of their own actions. Mr. Stormwind, I presume? The butler's voice carried the measured tones of someone accustomed to dealing with uncomfortable situations. Mr. Holloway is expecting you. Please follow me. The interior of the mansion was a study in conspicuous consumption, every surface decorated with imported luxuries that served no purpose beyond displaying the owner's ability to afford them. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, and the walls were lined with artwork that had been shipped around Cape Horn at enormous expense. Jesse felt like an intruder in a museum, his trail-worn clothing and weather-beaten appearance marking him as someone who clearly didn't belong in such rarefied surroundings. Richard Holloway waited in what was obviously his study, a room designed to impress visitors with its owner's importance and sophistication. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes that looked like they had never been opened. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, and hunting trophies decorated the walls, the heads of animals that had died to provide decoration. For a man who had probably never tracked anything more dangerous than his own shadow. At 32, Richard had the soft appearance of someone who had never missed a meal or worked with his hands, though Jesse could see traces of the fear and gratitude that had marked their last meeting 3 years ago. The blizzard had changed him in subtle ways. There was a nervous energy in his movements, a tendency to glance toward windows as if checking for signs of incoming weather, and the pale complexion of someone who now avoided unnecessary risks. Jesse, my God, it's good to see you again. Richard's enthusiasm seemed genuine, though it carried the slightly desperate quality of a man trying to convince himself that he was doing the right thing. Please, sit down. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee? Something stronger? Jesse remained standing, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the room and filing them away for future reference. I came to hear what you have to say about your daughter. Richard's smile faltered slightly at Jesse's directness, but he quickly recovered and gestured toward a leather chair that probably cost more than Jesse's cabin. Of course. Straight to business. I've always admired that about you. He moved to a sideboard and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey from a crystal decanter, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. Caroline is. She's been through a terrible ordeal, Richard began, settling into the chair behind his desk as if the massive piece of furniture could provide protection from uncomfortable truths. 8 months ago, she was riding in Golden Gate Park when her horse was startled by a steam carriage. The animal reared and fell backward, trapping her beneath its weight. The doctors did everything they could, but the damage to her spine was too severe. She'd never walk again. Jesse said nothing, waiting for the rest of the story. In his experience, wealthy men like Richard Holloway rarely told the whole truth on the first attempt, preferring to reveal uncomfortable details gradually, like peeling an onion one layer at a time. She was engaged to be married, Richard continued, his voice growing quieter as he spoke. Jonathan Blackwood, son of the shipping magnate. Fine family, excellent prospects. But when they learned about Caroline's condition, he took another drink, larger this time. The engagement was quietly dissolved, for her own good, they said. To spare her the embarrassment of a marriage that could never be complete. The bitterness in Richard's voice was real, and Jesse found himself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the man who had once seemed invincible in his privilege and arrogance. Watching your daughter abandoned by people who claim to love her would humble any father, regardless of his social standing or financial resources. The doctors recommended that she be placed in an institution, Richard said, the words coming out in a rush as if he needed to expel them before they poisoned him. A place in Sacramento where they care for people with similar limitations. But I couldn't do it. She's my only child, and despite everything, she's still brilliant, still beautiful, still the little girl who used to climb trees in our garden and demand that I read her stories about brave princesses who saved themselves. Jesse could hear the pain in the older man's voice, the desperate love of a father who had watched his daughter's world collapse and found himself powerless to rebuild it. It was the emotion he recognized, though his own experience with loss had been different, the weight of failing to protect people who had trusted him with their lives. "Where is she now?" Jesse asked. "In her room. She rarely comes downstairs anymore, rarely speaks to anyone except her nurse. She spends her days reading or staring out the window at the mountains, and Richard's voice broke slightly. I don't know how to help her. I don't know how to bring back the daughter I used to know. And you think marrying her to a stranger will solve that problem?" Richard set down his glass and looked directly at Jesse for the first time since the conversation had begun. "I think that Caroline needs someone who understands what it means to be rejected by a world that should have protected her. Someone who won't see her condition as a burden or a limitation, but as just another challenge to be overcome. Someone who has the strength to stand beside her instead of trying to stand in front of her." The words were carefully chosen, and Jesse suspected that Richard had been rehearsing this speech for days, trying to find the right combination of appeal to honor, practical necessity, and emotional manipulation. But beneath the calculated rhetoric, there was something else: genuine desperation, and the kind of love that was willing to accept any solution, no matter how unconventional, if it offered hope for his daughter's future. "I'd like to meet her," Jesse said. Richard nodded, as if he had been expecting this request. "Of course. But I should warn you, she's not the same person she was before the accident. The Caroline you're about to meet is angry. At the world, at God, at everyone who still has the use of their legs. She may not be particularly welcoming." Jesse followed Richard up a grand staircase that curved gracefully toward the second floor, past portraits of Holloway ancestors who gazed down with the stern disapproval of people who had never been forced to compromise their principles for survival. The hallway was lined with expensive wallpaper and lit by gas fixtures that cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a funeral home than a place where people actually lived. Richard stopped outside a door near the end of the hall and knocked softly. "Caroline? There's someone here I'd like you to meet." The voice that answered was sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. "I told you I don't want to see any more doctors. And if it's another one of your business associates come to gawk at the crippled Holloway girl, you can tell them the circus has moved on to Sacramento." "It's not a doctor," Richard said, his own voice carefully controlled. "It's Jesse Stormwind, the man who saved my life during the blizzard." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Jesse to count his own heartbeat, and when Caroline finally spoke again, her voice carried a different quality: curiosity, mixed with something that might have been bitter amusement. "Ah, the famous half-breed guide. Father's told me so much about you. Come to see what all the fuss is about, have you? Come to inspect the merchandise before you decide whether it's worth the asking price." Richard winced at his daughter's words, but Jesse stepped forward and spoke directly to the closed door. "I came to meet the woman they're trying to give away like she's broken goods. Figured I should hear her side of the story before I make up my mind about anything." Another long silence, then the sound of wheels moving across hardwood floors. The door opened to reveal Caroline Holloway, and Jesse felt his breath catch in his throat despite himself. She was beautiful in the way that winter storms were beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely compelling. Her dark hair fell in waves around a face that would have graced the cover of any fashion magazine, and her green eyes burned with intelligence and barely controlled fury, but it was her posture that struck Jessie most forcefully. She sat in her wheelchair like a queen holding court, her spine straight and her chin raised in defiance of anyone who might dare to pity her. This was not a woman who had been broken by her circumstances. She had been transformed by them, forged into something harder and more determined than she had ever been before. "So you're the famous Jessie Stormwind," she said, looking him up and down with the appraising gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "You're taller than I expected, and younger. Father made you sound like some grizzled mountain man with tobacco stains in his beard." "Disappointed?" Jessie asked. Carolyn's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "Pleasantly surprised, actually. I was expecting some decrepit old prospector who smelled like his horse and couldn't string two sentences together without spitting into a cuspidor." She gestured toward a chair positioned near the window. "Sit down, Mr. Stormwind. Let's have a conversation between two people who understand what it means to be unwanted." Jessie took the offered seat, noting how Caroline had positioned herself so that the afternoon light from the window fell across her face, highlighting her beauty while casting her disability into shadow. Even trapped in a wheelchair, she understood the importance of controlling how others perceived her. "Your father tells me you were engaged before the accident," Jessie said, deciding that directness would be more respectful than dancing around uncomfortable topics. "Jonathan Blackwood, heir to a shipping fortune and blessed with all the moral courage of a frightened rabbit." Caroline's voice carried no sadness, only contempt. "We were to be married last Christmas in a ceremony that would have united two great California families and provided excellent opportunities for business partnerships. Then my horse threw me, and suddenly Jonathan discovered that his delicate sensibilities couldn't bear the thought of a wife who might never give him children or accompany him to social functions where appearances matter more than substance. Sounds like you're better off without him." Carolyn laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "Better off? Mr. Stormwind, I am 23 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, and considered unmarriageable by every respectable family in California. My father is so desperate to see me settled that he's willing to offer me to a complete stranger in payment for a 3-year-old debt. In what possible way could I be considered better off?" Jessie considered her question seriously, studying her face in the golden afternoon light. "Because now you know exactly who Jonathan Blackwood really was underneath all that polish and breeding. If he'd married you before the accident, you might have spent years thinking you'd found love when all you'd really found was a man who could only care about you as long as you were perfect." Something flickered in Caroline's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the recognition that someone had finally said something worth thinking about. "And what about you, Mr. Stormwind? Are you here because you're the kind of man who can see past imperfection? Or because you're desperate enough to take whatever you can get?" The question was delivered like a challenge, and Jessie found himself respecting her willingness to confront uncomfortable truths directly rather than hiding behind polite pretense. "I'm here because Carl Weber and his friends have made it clear that I don't have any good choices left. But I'm talking to you instead of just accepting their offer because I wanted to find out if maybe we could figure out a way to help each other instead of just surviving whatever they have planned for. U.S." Caroline was quiet for a long moment, her intelligent eyes studying Jessie's face as if she were trying to read his thoughts. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was softer than before, though still edged with caution. "Help each other how, exactly?" "I don't know yet," Jessie admitted. "But I figure two people who understand what it means to be written off by the world might be able to come up with something better than what other people think we deserve." "And what do you think we deserve, Mr. Stormwind?" Jessie looked out the window toward the mountains that had shaped his entire life. thinking about the question she had asked and the answer that was forming in his mind. I think we deserve the chance to decide for ourselves what our lives are going to look like, instead of letting other people make those decisions for us. Carolyn followed his gaze toward the Sierra Nevada peaks that rose like cathedrals against the afternoon sky. I used to love those mountains, she said quietly. I used to ride up into the foothills every morning, just to watch the sunrise paint them gold and pink and purple. I thought they were the most beautiful thing in the world. What changed? Everything. The single word carried the weight of 8 months of pain, disappointment, and forced acceptance of a reality she had never wanted. When you can't walk, the world becomes very small very quickly. Beautiful things become reminders of everything you've lost instead of gifts to be grateful for. Jesse turned back to face her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who had learned hard truths through personal experience. The mountains haven't changed, Carolyn. They're still the same mountains that made you feel alive before your accident. Maybe the problem isn't that they've become reminders of what you've lost. Maybe the problem is that you haven't figured out a new way to reach them. Carolyn stared at him for a long moment, and Jesse could see something shifting in her expression. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the first faint possibility that hope might someday be possible again. You're not what I expected, she said finally. Neither are you. What were you expecting? Jesse considered the question carefully before answering. I was expecting someone who had been broken by what happened to her. Someone who needed to be rescued or taken care of. Instead, I find someone who's still fighting, even when she doesn't have anything left to fight for. And what am I supposed to fight for now, Mr. Stormwind? What great cause is going to give meaning to the life of a crippled woman in a world that has no place for people like me? Jesse stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had taught him everything he knew about survival, resilience, and the kind of strength that comes from refusing to surrender even when defeat seems certain. When he turned back to Carolyn, his dark eyes held an intensity that made her catch her breath. You fight for the right to define yourself instead of letting other people do it for you, he said. You fight to prove that what happened to your legs doesn't have anything to do with what's possible for your heart, or your mind, or your spirit. And if you want to really drive them crazy, you fight to be happy in spite of everything they've done to convince you that happiness is no longer an option for someone like you. Carolyn was quiet for so long that Jesse began to wonder if he had said too much, pushed too hard, revealed too much of his own desperate need to believe that redemption was possible for people who had been written off by the world. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note he hadn't heard before, not quite hope, but something that might grow into hope given time and care. You know, Mr. Stormwind, if we do decide to go through with this ridiculous arrangement, it's going to create quite a scandal. A half-breed guide marrying a crippled heiress. The gossips in San Francisco will talk about nothing else for months. Jesse smiled, and Carolyn was surprised to discover that his smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable than she had thought possible. Let them talk. People have been talking about me my whole life. At least, this time, they'll have something interesting to discuss. And what about the practical considerations? I can't cook, I can't clean, I can't do any of the things a frontier wife is supposed to do. What exactly would I bring to such a marriage besides my father's money and a lifetime of complications? Jesse looked at her sitting in her wheelchair, her chin raised in defiance and her eyes blazing with intelligence and determination, and realized that she had no idea how magnificent she truly was. You'd bring yourself, Carolyn. Your mind, your spirit, your refusal to give up even when everyone else has given up on you. That's not a complication. That's exactly what someone like me has been looking for his entire life. For the first time since the accident, Carolyn Holloway felt something stir in her chest that might have been the beginning of hope. Not hope for a return to her old life that was gone forever, but hope for something entirely new, something that might be even better than what she had lost if she had the courage to reach for it. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "The doctors ... they don't think I'll ever be able to have children. The damage to my spine, it affects more than just my ability to walk." Jesse nodded, understanding the weight of what she was telling him. "And you think that matters to me? Doesn't it? Most men want sons, want to pass on their name and their legacy." Jesse was quiet for a moment, thinking about legacy and the different ways a person could leave their mark on the world. "My grandfather used to tell me that some people are meant to create new life, and others are meant to protect the life that already exists. Maybe our legacy isn't supposed to be children of our own. Maybe it's supposed to be something else entirely." Caroline felt tears stinging her eyes, though she tried to blink them away before Jesse could notice. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met, or the most naive." "Maybe both," Jesse admitted. "But I've learned that sometimes the most naive thing you can do is believe that good things are still possible, even when everything around you suggests otherwise." As the afternoon light began to fade and evening shadows crept across the room, Caroline Holloway looked at Jesse Stormwind and realized that she was facing the most important decision of her life. She could accept his proposal and step into an unknown future with a man who saw her as something more than her limitations, or she could refuse and remain trapped in a world that had already decided she had nothing left to offer. For the first time in 8 months, the choice felt like it might actually be hers to make. Caroline's answer came at dawn, delivered not through words, but through action that shook the very foundations of Granite Falls society. As the first light crept over the Sierra Nevada peaks, she appeared on the mansion's front portico in her wheelchair, dressed in a traveling outfit of deep burgundy wool and carrying a single leather satchel. Jesse had been waiting in the garden since before sunrise, seated on a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, watching the sky change from black to gray to gold while wrestling with his own doubts about the path they were choosing. When he saw her emerge from the house, something shifted in his chest, not quite relief, but a recognition that this moment would divide his life into 2 distinct chapters, before Caroline, and everything that came after. She moved her wheelchair down the specially constructed ramp that her father had built months earlier, each turn of the wheels bringing her closer to a decision that would irrevocably alter both their destinies. "Second thoughts are perfectly natural," she called to him, her voice carrying across the morning air with characteristic directness. "If you're having them, now would be the time to voice them, before we make this arrangement official and scandal the entire territory." Jesse stood and walked toward her, noting how the early light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair and made her green eyes seem to glow with inner fire. "No second thoughts," he said, "but I have a condition." Caroline raised an eyebrow, and Jesse caught a glimpse of the imperious young woman she must have been before tragedy forced her to develop layers of armor around her heart. "You're in no position to make conditions, Mr. Stormwind. Unless I'm mistaken, you're the one facing legal troubles that could destroy your life." "That's exactly why I'm in a position to make conditions," Jesse replied. "Because I've got nothing left to lose, which means I can afford to walk away if this isn't going to work for both of us." The challenge in his voice seemed to please rather than offend her. Caroline had grown tired of people who treated her like fragile porcelain, tiptoeing around her feelings and making decisions for her own good. Jesse's willingness to engage with her as an equal, to acknowledge that she had power in this negotiation despite her physical limitations, was more refreshing than he could possibly know. "Very well, what's your condition?" Jesse looked toward the mountains that had shaped every day of his life, gathering his thoughts before speaking words that would reshape hers. "I won't be your keeper, Caroline. I won't spend my life pushing your wheelchair and making excuses for the places you can't go or the things you can't do. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it as partners. That means you figure out ways to carry your own weight, and I figure out ways to help you. Do things people think are impossible." Caroline stared at him for a long moment, and Jesse wondered if he had pushed too far, demanded too much from someone who was already struggling with limitations that most people couldn't imagine. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of excitement he hadn't heard before. "Partners," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Not husband and invalid wife, not caregiver and patient, but partners." "Partners," Jesse confirmed, "in everything. Including figuring out what we're actually going to do with our lives once we've gotten ourselves legally tangled up together." The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the parlor of the Holloway mansion, with only the absolute minimum number of witnesses required by California law. Richard Holloway stood as Caroline's escort, his face a careful mask that hid the complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope that warred in his heart. Samuel Pierce served as Jesse's witness, though his presence was motivated more by legal necessity than friendship. He wanted to ensure that all the paperwork was properly filed, and that his wealthy client's interests were protected. Judge Harrison Blackwell, a longtime friend of the Holloway family, performed the ceremony with the solemnity usually reserved for funerals. In his mind, that's exactly what this was: the burial of Caroline's prospects for a normal life and the formalization of an arrangement that satisfied social conventions while solving practical problems. He spoke the ancient words about love, honor, and cherishing, but his tone suggested he found them inappropriate for these particular circumstances. Caroline wore a dress of midnight blue silk that had been her mother's, altered to accommodate her seated position and decorated with a silver brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. She had refused to wear white, claiming that the color was reserved for brides who were beginning their lives rather than salvaging what remained of them. Jesse wore his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark wool pants, and a vest that his mother had embroidered with traditional Irish patterns. He had braided a single eagle feather into his hair, a Maidu symbol of strength and protection that drew disapproving glances from the white witnesses. The exchange of vows was brief and practical, stripped of the romantic flourishes that usually marked such occasions. When Judge Blackwell pronounced them husband and wife, Jesse knelt beside Caroline's wheelchair and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture that spoke more of respect and commitment than passion. It was not the wedding either of them had dreamed of as children, but it was theirs, and it marked the beginning of something entirely new. The reception that followed was an exercise in social awkwardness that would be remembered and discussed in Granite Falls for years to come. Richard had invited the town's leading citizens, partly from a desire to maintain appearances and partly from a need to demonstrate that his daughter's marriage, however unconventional, was still worthy of recognition. The guests came partly from curiosity, partly from obligation, and partly from the irresistible human desire to witness dramatic events firsthand. Carl Weber arrived with his wife Martha, a thin-lipped woman who had never missed an opportunity to remind others of their place in the social hierarchy. Marcus Dalton brought his eldest daughter, a pale young woman who kept stealing glances at Jesse, as if she couldn't quite believe that such an exotic creature was now legally part of their community. Various mine owners, shopkeepers, and their families filled out the gathering, creating a buzz of conversation that was equal parts congratulation and speculation. Jesse found himself the object of intense scrutiny, studied like a rare specimen that had somehow escaped from a natural history museum. His mixed heritage, his reputation as a tracker, and his role in the infamous Blizzard expedition made him a figure of fascination for people who rarely encountered anyone outside their own narrow social circles. Some of the attention was respectful. There were men in the room who had hired his services and knew his worth, but much of it carried the uncomfortable weight of prejudice disguised as curiosity. Caroline, meanwhile, commanded her own kind of attention. Before her accident, she had been one of the most sought-after young women in California, courted by the sons of wealthy families and featured in newspaper society pages. Now seated in her wheelchair beside a husband who represented everything her former life had rejected, she became something different, a cautionary tale, a tragedy, a reminder of how quickly fortune could reverse itself. But as the afternoon progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Carolyn, freed from the need to pretend that her life was somehow returning to normal, began to display a wit and intelligence that had been muted by months of well-meaning sympathy. When Mrs. Weber made a comment about how brave she was being, Caroline replied that bravery had nothing to do with it. She was simply making the best deal available to someone in her position. When Judge Blackwell offered condescending advice about learning to accept her limitations, she smiled sweetly and asked whether he planned to accept his own limitations or continue pretending he was qualified to practice law. Jesse watched his new wife navigate the social minefield with growing admiration. She was not merely surviving the attention, she was controlling it, directing conversations and deflecting pity with a skill that spoke of natural intelligence, sharpened by recent adversity. This was not a woman who needed to be rescued. This was a woman who had been waiting for the right opportunity to remind everyone exactly who she was beneath the tragedy that had temporarily defined her. The turning point came when young Timothy Morrison, son of the rancher who had hired Jesse to track the bear, approached them with the guileless curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide his thoughts behind social conventions. He stared at Caroline's wheelchair for a moment, then looked directly at her with eyes that held no pity, only honest interest. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Being in that chair all the time?" The adult conversation around them stopped as everyone waited to see how Caroline would respond to such directness from a 7-year-old. She looked down at Timothy with the first genuine smile Jesse had seen from her, and when she spoke, her voice carried warmth instead of the careful control she had maintained throughout the afternoon. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but not the way you think. The chair doesn't hurt my body, it just makes it hard to reach high shelves and go places where there are a lot of stairs. What hurts is when people see the chair instead of seeing me." Timothy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "My pass as Mr. Jesse can track anything in these mountains, even in the snow. Can you do things like that too?" Caroline glanced at Jesse, and something passed between them, a moment of shared understanding that this child was offering them something the adults couldn't. Simple acceptance of who they were, rather than judgment about who they should have been. "I don't know yet," Caroline told Timothy, "but I'm planning to find out." The conversation that followed marked a subtle shift in the afternoon's dynamics. Instead of being objects of curiosity or pity, Jesse and Caroline began to be seen as a couple with their own plans and possibilities. Jesse talked about his work as a tracker and guide, describing the mountains and wildlife with the passionate knowledge of someone who had made the wilderness his home. Caroline surprised everyone, including herself, by revealing that she had been studying botany and geology before her accident, and that her enforced confinement had given her time to read extensively about the natural history of the Sierra Nevada. "It's fascinating how much you can learn about a place without actually visiting it," she said to Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician and amateur naturalist. "I've been reading about alpine plant communities and their adaptation to high-altitude conditions. Some of the survival strategies they've developed are remarkably sophisticated." Dr. Hayes, who had been preparing to offer medical advice about her condition, found himself instead engaged in a technical discussion about botanical evolution that revealed the depth and breadth of Caroline's intellectual interests. Other conversations began to spring up around the room as people discovered that the new Mrs. Stormwind was not the tragic figure they had expected, but a woman with opinions, knowledge, and plans for her future. Jesse, meanwhile, found himself fielding questions about his tracking methods and wilderness survival techniques from men who had previously viewed him with suspicion or outright hostility. His marriage to Caroline seemed to have granted him a new kind of social legitimacy. as if her acceptance of him had forced others to reconsider their own prejudices. It was a strange and uncomfortable form of validation, but Jesse was pragmatic enough to recognize its value. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to prepare for their departure, Richard Holloway approached the newlyweds with an envelope that clearly contained important documents. His expression was carefully neutral, but Jesse could see the emotion he was struggling to contain. "Your wedding gift," Richard said, offering the envelope to Carolyn. "The deed to the old Peterson homestead up in Pine Valley. It's been abandoned for 2 years since old Henrik died, but the cabin is sound and there are 40 acres of good land. It's yours now, free and clear." Caroline opened the envelope and studied the legal documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of property ownership in a world where women rarely had such independence. The Peterson place was isolated, located in a valley high up in the foothills where the air was thin and the winters were harsh. But it represented something invaluable: the freedom to build a life away from the constant scrutiny and judgment of others. "Thank you, Father," she said quietly. This is more generous than I expected." Richard's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the love and worry that had driven all his recent decisions. "I want you to be happy, Caroline. I want you to have the chance to discover what that means for you now. And I want you to know that whatever you build up there, wherever your life takes you, you'll always have a place here if you need it." Jesse extended his hand to his new father-in-law, and after a moment's hesitation, Richard shook it firmly. "I'll take good care of her," Jesse said. "Not the way you mean, but the way she needs." "I'm beginning to think those might be the same thing," Richard replied. As the last of the guests departed and evening shadows began to creep across the mansion's grounds, Jesse and Carolyn found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. The enormity of what they had committed to was settling over them like a heavy blanket, bringing with it all the uncertainty and possibility that defined any major life change. "So," Carolyn said, maneuvering her wheelchair to face the mountains that rose beyond the mansion's perfectly manicured gardens. "Partners, what exactly does that mean in practical terms? What are partners supposed to do when they inherit an abandoned homestead in the middle of nowhere and have no idea how to make a life together?" Jesse followed her gaze toward the peaks that glowed gold and pink in the setting sun, thinking about all the abandoned dreams and broken plans that had led them to this moment. "I suppose we start by going up there and seeing what we have to work with. Then we figure out what we want to build and how we're going to build it together. And if it doesn't work? If we discover that this whole arrangement was a mistake born of desperation and wishful thinking?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out what's possible before we start worrying about what might go wrong." Caroline nodded, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of determination that reminded Jesse of the first time he had seen her, sitting in her wheelchair like a queen holding court. "Very well, Mr. Stormwind. Let's go see what kind of life we can build in the mountains." As darkness fell over the Sierra Nevada and the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Jesse and Carolyn Stormwind sat together on the mansion's front portico, planning a future that neither of them could fully imagine. They were bound now by law and circumstance, two broken people who had chosen to see if their jagged edges might fit together in ways that made them both stronger. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to their new home in Pine Valley, carrying with them nothing but their determination to prove that love could grow from respect, that partnership could flourish between equals regardless of their physical limitations, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life emerged from the most unlikely beginnings. Tonight, they were simply Jesse and Carolyn Stormwind learning what it meant to be married to someone who understood that strength came in many forms, and that the greatest adventures often began with the decision to trust a stranger with your heart. The wagon ride to Pine Valley tested every assumption Caroline had ever made about her own limitations. Jessie had rigged a special seat in the wagon bed, cushioned with blankets and secured with leather straps that allowed her to travel without the constant jarring that made most journeys unbearable. But the mountain trail was treacherous even in good weather, winding through granite passes where one wrong turn could send wagon, horses, and passengers tumbling hundreds of feet into rocky canyons below. 3 hours into the journey, Caroline discovered muscles she hadn't used in months. Every bump and sway of the wagon required her to brace herself with her arms, engage her core, and maintain balance in ways that her pampered life at the mansion had never demanded. By the time they reached the first rest stop beside Crystal Creek, her shoulders ached and her hands were cramped from gripping the wagon's rails, but she felt more alive than she had since the accident. "You're tougher than you look," Jessie observed, watching her transfer herself from the wagon to a fallen log beside the creek without asking for assistance. Most people from town would have been complaining about the rough ride by now. Caroline dipped her hands in the cold mountain water, studying her reflection in the rippling surface. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the pampered society belle who had spent months feeling sorry for herself in a luxury bedroom. Her hair had escaped its careful arrangement, her cheeks were flushed from exertion and fresh air, and her eyes held a brightness that had been absent for too long. "Maybe I'm not most people from town," she said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "Maybe I'm someone I haven't met yet." The Peterson homestead sat in a valley carved by ancient glaciers, surrounded by towering pine trees and granite cliffs that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. The cabin was larger than Jessie had expected, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, log walls chinked with mud and moss, and a covered porch that faced east toward the rising sun. Old Henrik Peterson had been a craftsman who understood mountain weather, building his home to withstand the fierce winds and heavy snows that could isolate Pine Valley for months at a time, but 8 months of abandonment had taken their toll. The roof leaked in 3 places, pack rats had invaded the storage areas, and the garden that had once provided vegetables was now a tangle of weeds and volunteer trees. Worse, the cabin had been built by, and for someone who could walk, the doorways were narrow, the floors were uneven, and everything from the kitchen counters to the sleeping loft was positioned for people who could stand and climb. Jessie helped Carol leaned down from the wagon and watched her survey their new home with the calculating gaze of an engineer assessing a challenging project. He expected disappointment, perhaps even tears, as the reality of their situation became clear. Instead, he saw something that made his heart race: excitement. "It's perfect," Carolyn said, maneuvering her wheelchair as close to the cabin as the rough ground would allow. "Not for what it is now, but for what it could become. You see something I'm missing?" Jessie asked. Carolyn pointed toward various features of the homestead with the enthusiasm of an architect unveiling blueprints. "The main room is large enough to be completely reconfigured. We can lower the kitchen area, widen the doorways, build ramps instead of steps. The sleeping area upstairs is useless to me, but we could convert it to storage and create a proper bedroom on the main floor. And look at that porch with some modifications. It could become an outdoor workspace where I could pursue my botanical studies." Jessie followed her gaze, trying to see the homestead through her eyes. Where he saw problems and obstacles, she saw opportunities and solutions. Her months of forced confinement had given her time to think about accessibility in ways that most people never considered, and now she was applying that knowledge to create something entirely new. "It'll be a lot of work," he warned. "Good," Caroline replied firmly. "I've had quite enough of being treated like an invalid who needs to be protected from exertion. I want to work. I want to build something with my own hands. I want to prove that my accident changed my circumstances but not my capabilities." The next 3 weeks transformed both the homestead and its inhabitants in ways that neither Jessie nor Caroline had anticipated. Working together from dawn to dusk, they began to reshape the cabin according to Caroline's vision and Jesse's practical skills. He handled the heavy construction, widening doorways, reinforcing floors, building the ramps and platforms that would allow her to move freely throughout their home. She managed the detail work, organizing materials, solving logistical problems, and applying her considerable intelligence to challenges that had no precedent in either of their experiences. The most dramatic change came when Jesse proposed removing the interior wall that separated the main room from the kitchen area. Caroline had been struggling to reach the high shelves and work surfaces, constantly frustrated by her inability to perform basic domestic tasks from her wheelchair. Jesse's solution was radical. Instead of adapting Caroline to the kitchen, they would completely rebuild the kitchen to suit Caroline. "You want to tear down a wall?" Caroline asked, studying his sketches with fascination. "Won't that weaken the entire structure?" "Not if we do it right," Jesse explained, his pencil tracing support beams and load distributions with the precision of someone who understood how buildings transferred weight and stress. "We'll add support posts here and here, create one large open space with different work areas at different heights. You'll have lower counters for food preparation, regular height surfaces for serving, and even some standing height areas for when we have guests who can't work at your level." The project required skills that neither of them possessed individually, but that they could develop together. Jesse's knowledge of construction and engineering provided the framework, while Caroline's analytical mind and attention to detail ensured that every modification served a practical purpose. They made mistakes counters that were too low, ramps with grades too steep for Caroline's wheelchair, storage solutions that looked good on paper, but proved unusable in practice. But each failure taught them something new about the relationship between form and function, about the difference between accommodation and true accessibility. Caroline's transformation was the most remarkable. The pampered society woman who had spent months feeling helpless began to emerge as someone entirely different. A problem solver, an innovator, a person who refused to accept that conventional wisdom about disability had any bearing on her individual circumstances. She developed calluses on her hands from sanding wood and hauling materials. Her arms and shoulders grew stronger from the constant movement required by construction work. Most importantly, her confidence began to return as she discovered that her mind was as sharp and useful as it had ever been. Jesse watched this metamorphosis with a mixture of admiration and growing attraction that surprised him. He had agreed to marry Caroline out of necessity and mutual benefit, expecting to develop at most a respectful partnership with someone who shared his understanding of being an outsider. Instead, he found himself falling in love with a woman who was becoming more beautiful and compelling with each passing day, not despite her disability, but because of the strength and creativity she was using to overcome its challenges. The crisis that tested their new partnership came during the fourth week, when early winter storms arrived with unusual ferocity. Jesse had been working on the roof repairs when the weather turned violent, trapping him on the steep pitch as freezing rain made every surface treacherous. Caroline, watching from the porch, realized that he was in serious danger of falling. Just as a gust of wind sent his hammer sliding toward the edge, her first instinct was to call for help, but there was no one to call. They were miles from the nearest neighbor, and the storm made travel impossible. Her second instinct was to feel helpless, to acknowledge that her disability made her useless in this emergency. Instead, she found herself analyzing the situation with cold precision, looking for solutions rather than dwelling on limitations. The ladder Jesse had used to reach the roof was still in place, but it was positioned where Caroline couldn't reach it from her wheelchair. However, she noticed that the porch railing was exactly the right height for her to use as support, and that a route existed from the railing to the base of the ladder if she was willing to abandon her chair and move across the ground using only her arms. Without hesitation, Caroline transferred herself from her wheelchair to the porch railing, then lowered herself to the muddy ground. The cold rain soaked through her clothes immediately, and the rough terrain scraped her legs as she pulled herself toward the ladder using a combination of arm strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. By the time she reached Jesse's position, her hands were bleeding and her clothes were torn, but she had managed to steady the ladder and provide him with a secure route to safety. "Are you out of your mind?" Jesse demanded as he climbed down. But Caroline could see the relief and admiration in his eyes despite his harsh words. "You could have been seriously hurt." "So could you," Caroline replied, allowing him to lift her back into her wheelchair. "That's what partners do, they take risks for each other when the situation demands it." That night, as they sat before the fireplace in their partially renovated cabin, Jesse found himself looking at his wife with new eyes. The society woman who had been offered to him as damaged goods had revealed herself to be someone far more valuable, a person who refused to let physical limitations define her capabilities, who could think clearly under pressure, and who was willing to risk her own safety to protect someone she cared about. "Caroline," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the botanical journal she had been reading, her face still flushed from their shared adventure and her hair still damp from the rain. "What is it?" "This arrangement of ours ... It's not what I expected when I agreed to marry you." Caroline felt her heart skip, wondering if he was preparing to tell her that their partnership wasn't working, that the reality of being married to a disabled woman was proving too difficult for him to bear. "What do you mean?" Jesse moved closer to her chair, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he struggled to find words for emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "I expected to respect you, maybe even to like you if we were fortunate. I expected we might become friends who happen to share a home and a name. I didn't expect ... "What?" Caroline whispered. "I didn't expect to fall in love with you." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of too much honesty. Caroline stared at him for a long moment, her brilliant mind analyzing his words for signs of pity, obligation, or the kind of protective affection that people sometimes confused with love. Instead, she saw something that made her heart race. Genuine desire, respect, and the kind of love that grew from truly knowing someone, rather than simply feeling sorry for them. "Jesse," she said softly, "what if I told you that I've been falling in love with you too?" He reached for her hands, noting the calluses and cuts that marked her transformation from pampered invalid to working partner. "Then I'd say that maybe we've both discovered something neither of us was looking for." Caroline leaned forward, and when Jesse kissed her, it was not the gentle, respectful gesture he had given her at their wedding. This was the kiss of a man who desired a woman for her strength, her intelligence, and her refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Caroline felt a warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "This changes things," she said. "Everything," Jesse agreed. "Are you ready for everything to change?" Jesse looked around their partially completed home, thinking about all the work still ahead of them and all the challenges they would face as an unconventional couple in a conventional world. Then he looked back at Caroline, seeing in her face the promise of adventures and discoveries that he had never dared to imagine. "With you," he said, "I'm ready for anything." Outside, the storm continued to rage through Pine Valley, but inside their cabin, Jesse and Caroline Stormwind had found something that neither the weather nor the world's prejudices could touch: a love built on equality, respect, and the shared determination to create a life that defied everyone's expectations about what was possible for people like them. The real adventure was just beginning. Winter's grip tightened around Pine Valley like a closing fist, but inside their transformed cabin, Jesse and Caroline had created something that neither the elements nor their enemies could easily destroy. The renovations were complete, a marvel of adaptive engineering that allowed Caroline to move freely through every room, reach every surface, and participate fully in the daily work of mountain living. What had begun as accommodation had evolved into innovation, creating a home unlike anything either of them had ever seen. But their isolation, which had seemed like protection from the judgment of others, was about to become their greatest vulnerability. The attack came on the night of the winter solstice, when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the temperature had dropped so low that the water in their wash basin turned to ice despite the constant fire. Jesse was outside checking their horses when he heard the sound that made his blood turn to ice water, the distinctive crack of boots breaking through frozen snow, moving with the deliberate stealth of men who didn't want to be detected. There were at least 6 of them, possibly more, spread out in a rough circle around the cabin. Jesse recognized the formation immediately. It was a hunting pattern, designed to prevent escape and ensure that their prey had nowhere to run. In the starlight, he caught glimpses of familiar faces beneath pull-blow hat brims. Marcus Dalton's foreman, Tom Brady, 2 of Carl Weber's men from the Mercantile, and others whose names he didn't know but whose intentions were crystal clear. Jesse slipped back toward the cabin, moving with the silence his grandfather had taught him, his mind racing through options that grew more limited with each heartbeat. The attackers had positioned themselves to control all the obvious escape routes, and the deep snow made movement difficult for anyone on foot. Worse, they clearly knew about Caroline's condition. They had chosen a night when the cold would make it nearly impossible for her to survive outside for any length of time. He reached the cabin's back door just as the first shouts erupted from the front yard. "Stormwind, we know you're in there. Come out, and we might let your wife live long enough to see morning." Through the window, Jesse could see Caroline in her wheelchair beside their workbench, her hands moving with quick precision as she loaded the hunting rifle he had taught her to use. Her face was pale but determined, and when their eyes met across the room, she nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more trust and partnership than 1,000 words could have managed. "What do you want?" Jesse called through the door, though he already knew the answer. The legal threats Carl Weber had made months earlier had apparently been replaced by more direct action. "Justice for the men you killed in that blizzard," came the reply. "Their family sent us to collect what the courts won't give them." "The courts cleared me of any wrongdoing," Jesse shouted back, checking the loads in his own rifle while scanning the room for defensive positions. "The courts don't speak for grieving widows and fatherless children," Brady called. "Tonight, we settle this the way it should have been settled 3 years ago." Jesse understood now that this had always been inevitable. The marriage to Caroline, the legal protection it was supposed to provide, the attempt to build a new life away from his past, all of it had been temporary measures against enemies who were patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. Weber and his allies had simply bided their time until winter, isolated their targets completely. The first bullets shattered the cabin's front windows, sending glass cascading across the floor like deadly snow. Caroline immediately rolled her chair behind the heavy oak table Jesse had built, using it as cover while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the main door. Jesse took position near the window, returning fire at muzzle flashes in the darkness, while trying to count their attackers and assess their equipment. "There's at least 8 of them," he called to Caroline during a brief lull in the shooting. "They've got us surrounded, and they're not planning to take prisoners." "Then we don't give them any," Caroline replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She fired twice in quick succession, and Jesse heard a yelp of pain from the darkness that suggested at least one of her shots had found its mark. The siege stretched through the longest night of the year, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the bitter cold of the Sierra Nevada winter. The attackers had supplies and numbers on their side, but Jesse and Caroline held the defensive advantages of shelter, preparation, and desperation. More importantly, they fought with the coordination of true partners who understood each other's capabilities and trusted each other completely. Jesse used his knowledge of traditional Maidu warfare, moving constantly to prevent the attackers. From pinpointing his position, creating diversions that allowed Caroline to move to new firing positions. Caroline applied her analytical intelligence to the tactical situation, tracking ammunition expenditure, predicting attack patterns, and identifying the most dangerous threats among their enemies. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of potential rescue or reinforcement, the attackers grew more aggressive. Brady and two others attempted to rush the cabin's back door, while the remaining men provided covering fire from the front. It was a coordinated assault that might have succeeded against ordinary defenders, but Jesse and Caroline had become something extraordinary through their months of shared challenges. Jesse met the rear assault with controlled fury, his rifle speaking with the rhythm of a war drum as he drove the attackers back into the snow. Caroline, meanwhile, maintained steady fire from her position, forcing the men at the front to keep their heads down and preventing them from supporting their companions. Charged. The turning point came when Caroline spotted Tom Brady attempting to circle around to the cabin's blind side, where he could set fire to the building and force them out into the open. Without hesitation, she abandoned her defensive position and rolled her chair toward the window that offered the best angle for an intercepting shot. Brady was almost in position when Caroline's rifle cracked once, sending him tumbling into a snowdrift with a cry of pain and rage. The sound of his fall seemed to break something in the remaining attackers, the realization that their carefully planned assault was being defeated by the very people they had expected to slaughter like helpless sheep. "This ain't over, Stormwind," Brady shouted as the surviving attackers began to withdraw into the gray dawn light. "You can't hide up here forever. We'll be back, and next time we'll bring enough men to finish what we started." Jesse didn't respond to the threat, but he and Caroline both understood that their enemies were right about one thing. This remote cabin that had become their sanctuary could also become their tomb if they remained passive targets for future attacks. As the last of the gunfire faded and the attackers disappeared into the forest, Jesse and Caroline found themselves alone with the wreckage of their home and the knowledge that everything had changed once again. The windows were shattered, furniture was splintered by bullets, and their carefully constructed haven bore the scars of violence that would never completely heal. But they were alive. They had fought as equals, and they had proven something important to themselves and their enemies. They were not victims waiting to be destroyed. They were partners who could defend what they had built together. "What do we do now?" Caroline asked, surveying the damage with the practical eye of someone already planning repairs and improvements. Jesse looked at his wife, brilliant, fierce, unbroken, despite everything the world had thrown at her, and realized that he finally understood what his grandfather had meant about the spirits writing stories in the stars. "Now," he said, "we stop running from our past and start taking control of our future." Spring came to Pine Valley like a promise kept, melting the snow that had trapped Jesse and Caroline through the long winter months and revealing a world transformed by more than just the changing seasons. The repairs to their cabin were complete, but the building that emerged bore little resemblance to the modest homestead they had inherited. Jesse's engineering skills and Caroline's innovative vision had created something unprecedented, a mountain retreat that was both fortress and laboratory, accessible to Caroline while serving as a base for ventures that neither of them could have imagined alone. The most dramatic addition was the observatory Caroline had designed and Jesse had built on the cabin's reinforced roof, accessible by a pulley system that lifted her wheelchair through a specially constructed shaft. The platform offered an unobstructed view of the entire Sierra Nevada range while providing the perfect vantage point for the astronomical and botanical observations that had become Caroline's passion. Jesse had installed a sophisticated telescope, purchased with money from Richard Holloway, And Caroline had spent the winter months mapping star patterns and documenting the seasonal changes in high-altitude plant communities. But the observatory served another purpose that their enemies would soon discover. From its elevated position, nothing could approach Pine Valley without being seen for miles. The platform that Caroline used for studying the stars also made her the most effective sentry in the entire Sierra Nevada range. The transformation in Caroline herself was even more remarkable than the changes to their home. 8 months of mountain living had built muscle and endurance that her previous life could never have developed. Her arms and shoulders were powerful from hauling herself up climbing ropes and maneuvering through terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers. Her mind had been sharpened by constant problem-solving and the intellectual stimulation of her research. Most importantly, she had discovered that her limitations were largely imaginary, created by other people's assumptions, rather than any actual constraints on her capabilities. Jesse watched her navigate the mountain paths in the specialized mountain wheelchair he had designed for her, its large wheels and rugged construction allowing her to travel terrain that would have been impossible in her original chair. She moved with confidence and speed, reading the landscape with skills that rivaled his own and contributing observations that enhanced his traditional tracking knowledge with scientific precision. Their partnership had evolved beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. Jesse's wilderness expertise combined with Caroline's analytical intelligence had created a unique resource that was beginning to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Word had spread about the couple who could solve problems that stumped experienced guides, who could find lost people and lost things in country that other searchers had given up as hopeless. The letter that would change everything arrived with the spring mail delivery, carried by a postal rider who had to navigate treacherous mountain paths to reach Pine Valley. The envelope bore the official seal of the United States Geological Survey, and its contents would offer Jesse and Caroline an opportunity that neither of them had dared to hope for. Dr. Carolyn Stormwind, the letter began, using the title that Caroline had earned through her botanical research and publications. We have reviewed your submitted papers on alpine plant adaptation and high-altitude ecosystem dynamics with considerable interest. Your unique methodology for conducting observational research in previously inaccessible locations has applications that extend far beyond botany. We would like to offer you and your partner a position as field research specialists for the upcoming survey of Yosemite Valley and the surrounding wilderness areas. Caroline read the letter aloud with growing excitement, her voice trembling as she reached the compensation details and the scope of work being offered. This was not charity or accommodation for her disability. This was recognition of her abilities, and an offer of meaningful work that would utilize both her scientific training and Jesse's wilderness expertise. They want us to work together, she said, looking up at Jesse with tears of joy in her eyes. Not you helping me or me being included. Out of sympathy, but both of us as equal partners contributing our different skills to the same project. Jesse took her hands, noting the calluses and strength that marked her transformation from pampered society woman to capable mountain researcher. Partners, he said, echoing the word that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Just like we always said. The celebration of their new opportunity was interrupted by the sound that had haunted their dreams since the winter. Attack horses approaching Pine Valley with the deliberate pace of men who had serious business to conduct. But this time, Jesse and Caroline were ready for whatever threat might be coming their way. From her position in the observatory, Caroline counted the riders with the precision of a military scout. 12 men, she called down to Jesse. Armed, but riding openly rather than trying to approach with stealth. They're confident, which means they're either very dangerous or very stupid. Jesse emerged from the cabin with his rifle in hand, but his posture was relaxed rather than defensive. He had spent the winter months preparing for this confrontation, and he was no longer the same man who had been backed into a corner by Karl Weber's threats. The months of building a life with Caroline had given him something worth fighting for, and the confidence that came from knowing he wasn't fighting alone. Karl Weber led the group, his expensive clothes and polished equipment marking him as someone who expected the world to accommodate his convenience. But there was something different about his manner, a wariness that suggested he had finally recognized that Jesse and Caroline were not the helpless victims he had originally assumed them to be. "Stormwind," Weber called as he dismounted. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," Jesse replied, noting the positions of the other riders and calculating fields of fire from Caroline's elevated position. "But make it quick. My wife and I have important work to do." Weber's expression showed his surprise at Jesse's confident tone and direct manner. This was not the desperate man who had been forced to accept charity in the form of a disabled wife. This was someone who spoke with the authority of a person who had options and wasn't afraid to use them. "There's been a development," Weber said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Tom Brady and the men who attacked your cabin, they won't be troubling you anymore." Jesse waited for the rest of the explanation, his rifle held casually, but ready to be brought into action within seconds. "Brady got drunk in Sacramento and started bragging about the vigilante raid," Weber continued. "Word got back to the territorial marshal. He's arrested 3 of the men and issued warrants for the others. There's going to be a trial, and Brady's talking about making a deal with the prosecutor by naming everyone who was involved in planning the attack." Now Jesse understood why Weber had come calling with such a large escort. The man who had orchestrated months of legal and physical threats was now facing the possibility of criminal charges himself, and he needed Jesse's silence to avoid prosecution. "What do you want from me?" Jesse asked. "Your word that you won't testify against the men who hired Brady," Weber said. "In exchange, we'll make sure that all legal troubles related to the Blizzard incident disappear permanently. Clean slate, no more threats, no more problems." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer and its implications. A year ago, he would have jumped at the chance to end the legal troubles that had haunted him since the avalanche. But a year ago, he had been a different person, someone who saw himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the master of his own destiny. "I've got a better offer," Jesse said finally. "You withdraw all legal threats, and I won't tell the marshal about your role in organizing the attack on my home. But there's one more condition." Weber's face darkened with anger at Jesse's presumption in making demands rather than accepting. "The offered terms, what condition?" Jesse gestured toward the observatory where Caroline was visible at her telescope, studying the landscape with the confidence of someone who owned her place in the world. "You publicly acknowledge that Caroline and I are legitimate members of this community, with the same rights and respect as any other married couple. No more whispers about charity cases or damaged goods. No more treatment like we're something to be ashamed of or hidden away." "You're in no position to make demands," Weber snarled. "Actually, I am," Jesse replied, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made several of Weber's men shift nervously in their saddles. "Because I've got something you need, my silence, and you've got nothing I want except your agreement to treat us like human beings." From her position in the observatory, Caroline called down with information that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Jesse, there are federal marshals approaching from the South Trail. 3 riders about 10 minutes out." Weber's face went pale as he realized that his window for negotiating a private settlement was rapidly closing. If federal law enforcement officers arrived while he was on Jesse's property with a group of armed men, explanations would be required that could lead to uncomfortable questions about recent events. "All right," Weber said quickly, "you have my word. Full recognition, equal treatment, no more problems." "In writing," Jesse demanded, "signed in front of witnesses." Weber's jaw clenched with fury, but he nodded agreement. There was no time for further negotiation, and both men understood that the arrival of federal authorities would complicate everything for everyone involved. as Weber and his men departed hastily, hoping to avoid encountering the approaching marshals. Carolyn descended from the observatory with a smile that lit up her entire face. Did you see his expression when he realized he'd lost all his power over us? Jesse helped her from the elevator platform and pulled her close, marveling at how this woman who had been offered to him as a burden had become the source of all his strength and confidence. We did that together, he said. All of it, the house, the research, standing up to Weber. None of it would have been possible without both of us. Caroline reached up to touch his face, her eyes reflecting the afternoon sunlight that streamed through their modified windows. When they gave me to you as mockery, they thought they were disposing of two broken people who deserved each other. What did they actually do? Jesse asked, though he already knew the answer. They gave two eagles, who had forgotten how to fly, the chance to remember that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. As evening fell over Pine Valley and the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Jesse and Caroline Stormwind sat together on their reinforced porch, planning the research expedition that would take them into Yosemite Valley and beyond. They were no longer the desperate people who had accepted a marriage of convenience. They were partners who had discovered that love born from respect and shared purpose was stronger than any obstacle the world could place in their path. In the distance, the Sierra Nevada peaks caught the last light of the setting sun, their granite faces glowing with colors that seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. Jesse and Caroline had learned to read those stars the way Jesse's ancestors had, as guides for navigation and sources of hope for travelers who refused to accept that any destination was beyond their reach. They had been given to each other as a cruel joke, but they had transformed that joke into something beautiful, something strong, something that soared higher than anyone had ever imagined possible. The stars were calling, and Jesse and Carolyn Stormwind were finally ready to answer.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.